Hey y'all, you're listening to the Theology Mill from Whitfinstock Publishers. I'm your host, Zach Mickle. Thanks as always for joining us today. On this episode, I chat with Dr. Eric Reitan about his book entitled Troubled Paradise, Limited Salvation, and the Problem of Heavenly Grief. Eric is professor of philosophy at Oklahoma State University, and he's the author of Is God a Delusion? A Reply to Religion's Cultured Despisers, another book entitled The Triumph of Love, Same-Sex Marriage, and the Christian Love Ethic, and then a novel entitled So Eden Sank to Grief. He's also the co-author with John Kronen of a book on Christian Universalism, and that book is called God's Final Victory, a comparative philosophical case for universalism. If you'd like to stay connected with us at the Theology Mail, you can follow us on X or on YouTube, or you can subscribe to our newsletter for monthly news and book deals. See the links in the description below to learn more about each of those. And if you're feeling generous, a 5-star rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts always means a lot to us, so thanks if you're able to do that. And with that, let's jump to the conversation with Dr. Eric Reitan. I hope you enjoy, and thank you so much for tuning in. So I'm fortunate to be here today with Eric Reitan to talk about his book with Cascade called Troubled Paradise, Limited Salvation, and the Problem of Heavenly Grief. So Eric, thanks so much for joining the Theology Mill today. As we begin, could you maybe just share with our listeners a bit about yourself and your work?
Okay, well, I'm a philosophy professor at Oklahoma State University. I specialize in philosophy of religion and ethics, and especially the intersection of the two. And this book, among other works that I've done, sort of fits within that focus, the sort of intersection of questions in philosophy of religion and in ethics. I should also note that the work I do tends to blur the line between philosophy of religion and philosophical theology. I don't think it's a clean line anyway, but a lot of the work that I do could be classified more as philosophical theology than philosophy of religion. So that's just a few words about myself. I've had a long-standing interest in issues about salvation, the scope of salvation, the doctrine of hell, and universalism. And this book fits in with that research project.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you for that background. Okay, before we get into the book, I open every episode with our kind of Theology Mill opener question, which we've recently in the last few episodes tweaked a bit. So the new I won't say improved, but the new opener question is: if you could have dinner with any one thinker, and they can be dead or alive, it could be a philosopher, theologian, it could be a family member, it could be anybody. Who would you choose? And what's kind of one burning question that you would most want to ask that person?
Yeah, so um, I was thinking about this question, and it's actually a no-brainer given the project I'm working on right now. I'm working on a book on Martin Luther King Jr.'s method of nonviolent resistance, and what it is, its philosophical and theological underpinnings, and how it can be applied in our contemporary world with its polarization and social media
Mm-hmm.
uh, environments, and just the technologies of communication and conflict that we have today. How can that method be adapted? That's at least the idea for the book. And I would love to have Martin Luther King Jr.'s own take on that. How do you apply the core ideas of his method to our contemporary environment. So yeah, I'd have dinner with Martin Luther King Jr. and ask for his insights into my current book project.
Sure. Do you feel like you have any sense of how he might respond? Or I mean, I know you're working on the book project, so you're probably starting to intuit kind of maybe some of the basic ways he might answer that question. Do you feel like you have a sense for kind of where he might go with that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the method of nonviolent resistance, is about cultivating a certain inner spirit that's rooted in the love ethic, the Christian love ethic, that distinguishes between the person who is doing wrong and the wrong that they're doing, and extends love and grace to the person even as one opposes the injustices that are being perpetrated or whatever.
Mhm.
And that way of engaging with someone who you think is doing something wrong is, in a certain sense, the antithesis of the norm in our social media environments,
Mm,
and
mhm.
the debates that you see online. And so, one of the big ways in which this method could be applied in our contemporary world would play out in terms of promoting a different kind of engagement in disagreements uh,
Sure. Yeah.
in in this virtual environment that we've created for ourselves. And I mean, the other thing that occurred to me is when you're talking about sort of more large scale in person protest actions, which of course
Mm,
King
mhm.
um, was involved with. One of the things that has changed so dramatically between King's Day and now is that everyone has in their pocket a device that can live stream what is happening in the protest action to the world, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that creates both risks and opportunities for any kind of nonviolent protest action. One of the things that King was like really aware of in the civil rights actions that he helped to lead and organize, um, was that even one person within the group of protesters acting out violently or attacking, even in self-defense, um, would uh, become the focus of attention, right?
Mm,
And uh, you know, in his civil rights, the history of his civil rights campaign, um, when he was first sort of thrust into prominence at during the Montgomery bus boycott,
mhm.
um, he uh, not only believed in the right to self-defense, but he tried to get a concealed carry permit because he felt threatened, right?
Mm,
And so while he was advocating that um, that the movement be nonviolent. In his early writings and speeches about this, he would sometimes say, "Now, of course, the if you're personally attacked, that's a different matter, right? And you have the
mm,
right to defend yourself, right? The movement should be nonviolent, but if someone attacks you, you have a right as a person with dignity to defend yourself." And later in his career, he changed his tune on
mm,
self defense, at least when you were actively participating in a nonviolent campaign.
mhm.
And the reason I think why he changed his tune was because he had this experience that if you have a nonviolent campaign, and your participants in this nonviolent action are being nonviolent, and then someone attacks violently, and they respond with violence. As he puts it, it sort of muddies the waters.
Yeah.
It becomes the focal point of attention, and it's going to be taken out of context. And all you'll see is some, two people hitting each other. You don't know who started it. You don't, right? If you weren't present, if you weren't there. And that sort of problem seems to be even more magnified today, where we see, massive nonviolent protests, and sort of when the protests sort of trickles down and ends for the day, and there's a few people remaining about, and then some hoodlums show up and set fire to something, right?
Yeah.
That becomes filmed and distributed around
Yeah.
the world, and the entire protest is painted with the brush of that image, right? So so I think he would be even more, I think, vigilant about the discipline of nonviolence in direct action
Yeah.
campaigns,
Yeah.
and discipline in sort of drawing a sharp line between the direct action, the civil rights, campaign or whatever, and what others are doing at the margins, right? Somehow you have to say, all right, the action begins here, it ends here. These are who are involved, and if there's someone throwing bricks 2 hours later, that's not us, right? There has to be this very clear discipline of nonviolence, and some structure that facilitates distinguishing between the nonviolent campaign and something that someone else in the vicinity.
Yeah. Yeah, those are really interesting points. I remember, just personally, I remember I went to just one protest event after sort of everything with George Floyd back in 2020, and it was very kind of the phenomenon you're talking about, where it was like for the most part while I was there a very peaceful protest, but then as kind of the crowd dwindled late into the night, there are less and less people. Things started to get more and more raucous, and you started seeing people throwing water bottles at the police officers and stuff like this. And at that point, my friends and I were like, okay, I think it's time to get out of here, because we were not interested in doing that. But then, of course, you see streamed online that these were sort of violent protests or were called riots or something, where in fact the picture was a lot more complicated. This is going to be a rough segue, but I want to transition from talking about maybe kind of non-violence and violence to kind of in a more cosmic sphere, right? So we're talking about your book on salvation, dealing with sort of whether we're looking at a non-violent or violent sort of God, and how that works in terms of the salvation of souls. I thought we could kind of start by just defining some terms that are really, really important in your book and that will probably come up a lot in this conversation, so that folks will know what we're talking about. So how would you describe, for instance, the two terms that I'd like us to maybe kind of try to define a bit at the beginning are maybe perfect blessedness, right? So you talk about the perfectly blessed, or just the blessed for shorthand, a lot in the book, versus kind of the eternally damned, or sometimes for shorthand you might just say the damned. How would you kind of describe those two?
Okay, so perfect blessedness is the state of the saved in heaven, and historically that has been conceived as featuring a few things. One, moral sanctification. The perfectly blessed are sanctified by divine grace, so that all sin is removed and they are morally perfected. Second, perfect joy, that is our happiness, that is untainted by or undisturbed by negative, painful emotions and things like that. And third, that, this perfect joy is experienced in community with God and the other blessed, a loving community. So, and the joy is a lot. The main sort of source of the joy of the blessed in heaven is this loving community of the blessed under God, right? A community of, because it's morally perfected, a perfect mutual love, right?
Mm-hmm.
So because the blessed are perfected morally, they're perfected in love. Their community is a perfectly loving community in which everyone loves everyone else with the love of God, right? They're instruments of divine love in relation to one another, and that is a source of perfect joy. That would be the way I would describe perfect blessedness. My understanding of how that concept has been conceived through the ages, its sort of chief elements. Eternal damnation is, at a very minimum, being eternally cut off from that community, right? But generally, it's construed as a state of horrific misery, right? And there's different ways of unpacking eternal damnation, depending on different ideas about its source, right? There's some views where eternal damnation is a result of the choice of creatures to reject the offer of divine grace that makes possible participation in the heavenly community, and they just experience the natural consequences of that. And then there's understandings of eternal damnation whereby it is, in fact, an imposed punishment that is justified as a proportional response to sinfulness. And so there's different ways of construing eternal damnation, relative to whether it's sort of a natural consequence of free choices on the one hand, or something imposed by God as a punishment for sin on the other hand. And that leads to sort of different concepts or understandings of the doctrine of hell. But most who believe in the doctrine of hell, whether they ascribe to what I've called the liberal doctrine, the doctrine that C.S. Lewis gestures towards when he says, the doors of hell are locked from the inside, or the more traditional retributive doctrine, where hell is an imposed punishment inflicted by God upon sinners. Both agree that the resultant state is horrible. And, it would be obvious that, on the case of the retributive punishment model, but why would this state be horrible for someone who's sort of chosen alienation from the blessed community and God's love and God's grace? Well, if God is the source of all that is really good, what is being chosen here is alienation from all that can give value and meaning to an enduring existence. And so one exists eternally without the things that give positive meaning and value to one's existence. Furthermore, sin is a corruption of one's fundamental nature and a source of misery for the sinner that's sort of intrinsic or internal. And without divine grace, we can't overcome sin. And so what we're talking about is an eternal existence deprived of all good things, but afflicted by the poison of sinfulness that brings with it just a kind of cycle of ultimately over the course of an eternal existence, psychological ruin. So that would be my understanding of the concept of eternal damnation. Now, I should add that in the book, I talk more often about the eternally lost than about the eternally damned.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is because I want to talk not only about the doctrine of hell, but also the doctrine of annihilationism. And according to annihilationists, those who don't experience perfect blessedness in heaven, those who aren't saved, they don't go to eternal hell. They aren't eternally damned. Instead, they are annihilated or just put out of existence altogether.
Mm-hmm.
So there are different ideas about what happens if you're not perfectly blessed, if you're not one of the saved. What's the alternative? The most traditional view is that you're eternally damned in one or more of the senses that I just sketched out. But there is this minority view that has been around for a long time and has been growing in popularity in the last decades among evangelical Christians, that you're ultimately put out of existence. And that might be after a time, right? You suffer a finite hell and then are put out of existence, or it might be immediately. If you're not among the saved, then you just go out of existence. Or it might be something that happens after the resurrection or something, then you're put out of existence. But so I talk a fair bit about, or more often I'm talking about the eternally lost than the eternally damned, because I want to include annihilationism within the scope of my discussion. And so there, annihilationism and the traditional doctrine of hell view are both doctrines of limited salvation, as I put it, where salvation does not extend to all. And so there are those who don't enjoy perfect blessedness. And so what's the state of them? Well, maybe they're eternally damned. Maybe they are annihilated. Either way, they're eternally lost. Right. Now, of course, the alternative to either of those views is universalism. And that's the view that all eventually come to experience perfect blessedness. May not be immediate. There may be a finite hell, right? Those who reject God at the end of this life, or who are unrepentant of their sins at the end of this life, may not be ready for, won't be ready for that community. But eventually all will come to repentance, right? The idea of the Universalist is that eventually, after a finite hell, everyone is ushered into perfect blessedness.
Yeah, no, that's great. So basically, we have you've done a really nice job of kind of laying out right. So on the one hand, like we talked about the perfect blessedness, and then on the other, sort of eternal damnation or eternal lostness, and then you've also just really dipped into kind of several theories on the scope of salvation that you present in the book, right? So we have perfect blessedness and eternal damnation as sort of states of existence, maybe. We could say following upon whether one is sort of saved or damned or abandoned or annihilated, whatever we want to, however we want to talk about it, or whichever view we subscribe to. And then you have kind of also ideas around kind of the mechanism of how this salvation and damnation or abandonment, annihilation, how that mechanism sort of operates. So, and really, there again, we're talking about kind of theories on the scope of salvation. So basically, you've just laid out for us kind of the three that you cover in your book, which are infernalism, which is kind of the traditional view, as you mentioned, and annihilationism, both of which would fall under kind of limited salvation, as you said, and then the third being universalism or universal salvation. So you said a bit about each of those already and kind of what distinguishes them. If you want to say more, you're welcome to. But one thing I'm really curious about is how monolithic are these views, or would you say that there are kind of significant variants within each of those three views as well? So among sort of the camp of infernalists or annihilationists or universalists, is there significant variety in sort of how they understand how these mechanisms work?
Yeah, I mean there clearly is variety, right? And I mean, I already mentioned with respect to the traditional, doctrine of hell, the distinction between what I call the liberal and the conservative retributive doctrine. Uh, is this state a natural consequence of free choices, or is it something imposed by God? And so you have that kind of divide, um, and there's further, divisions and disagreements, even among those who thinks that hell is something imposed by God as a punishment. There are ranges of possible views, right? You could think that the alienation is imposed by God, right? God puts up the barrier and says, you can't come into heaven. You're excluded as a punishment for your unrepentant sinfulness. So that's imposed by God. So even if uh, the sinner in that state uh, changes their mind, uh, well, it's not their choice that determines whether they're in heaven or hell. It's God. So
Mhm.
they might still endure uh, eternal uh, suffering, even if they were to repent later, right? So that's one possibility. And so you could have someone who holds that view that it's a punishment, but then doesn't hold to the idea of further suffering heaped upon the uh, the unrepented sinner, or something like that. And so you might have variations there, even among those who think, right, is is it just the alienation, the being exiled, that is hell, or is it more than exile? Is it inflicted torture or something like that? Right? You have theologians in early Protestant theologians who paint this picture of hell as each of the senses is subjected to the worst possible experience that sense can endure. So when you're in hell, you are not only inflicted with the worst possible physical pain you can endure, burning, uh, but you're going to be afflicted with horrible smells, right? That sense of
Mhm.
smell will be assaulted by stenches that are just terrible, and everywhere you look, your sight will be afflicted with ugliness, right, and etc. Right.
Mhm.
So, uh, so there are different ideas about what the punishments of hell look like, even.
Mhm.
And then on the flip side, if you think that those who are damned are those who have freely rejected God, that the doors of hell are locked from the inside, and that if only they changed their minds, they would be saved. There, your idea is that the reason anyone is in hell eternally is because they never wise up, right? They never repent, they never turn or change their choices, and so they suffer eternally. So you're going to have less variation there, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But still, you might have variation because some people might think that, well, hell is not necessarily so bad, right? So, I mean, I find gestures towards this in some of Eleanor Stump's writing that the while the suffering of hell could be terrible, how bad it is a function of what you bring there, right? What you bring to
Mm-hmm.
that state of alienation, the kinds of sins that you're guilty of, and she thinks that Dante's Inferno is meant to sort of reflect that idea. Whereas Marilyn McCord Adams thinks, on the contrary. Now, she's a universalist, but her view is that if we are made for God, as she thinks Christianity teaches, and we are alienated from God, we are alienated from the only thing that can make an eternal existence endurable, that will inevitably for everyone be a source of utter despair, right? Who endures that? And so she doesn't think that hell could be moderately tolerable or something like that for anyone. No, ultimately, for everyone, it's going to be utter horror because it's an eternal existence cut off from the only thing that can make an eternal existence endurable, the goods that proceed from the divine. So you're going to have a variety of views, and you're going to also have a variety of views among universalists. I just recently wrote a preface to a book on that was a collection of diverse versions or visions of universalism, and partly that is about questions of scope too, right? Universalists are agreed that all humans are ultimately saved, right? But they don't necessarily agree on whether that extends to non-human animals. Does it extend to fallen angels, right? There's disagreement among universalists about questions like that. And then there's disagreement about, right, the most traditional Christian sort of patristic universalism holds that while some are saved, right, in this life and go immediately to heaven, others have to go through hell first, right? And so they affirm a finite hell. But not every universalist necessarily affirms a finite hell. And so you're going to have a variety of different views there as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you for that. Okay, so now that you've very helpfully kind of drawn out a map of the terrain for us, maybe let's zoom in a bit on the problem of heavenly grief, right? It's right in your subtitle of the book, right? And obviously it features very prominently throughout the book. So I thought we could talk a bit about that and what you mean by that. So could you explain a bit for our listeners kind of what this problem of heavenly grief is, sort of what it entails, what's kind of the problem that your book is trying to address?
Yeah. So the problem of heavenly grief is a problem that arises for anyone who embraces two doctrines that, for reasons I'll get into, look to be incompatible. They are the doctrine of limited salvation and the doctrine of perfect blessedness. The doctrine of limited salvation we already talked about, but it's the idea that some created persons just are never saved. They're eternally lost, either damned or annihilated. The doctrine of perfect blessedness is the doctrine that the saved or the blessed enjoy an eternal life that's characterized both by moral sanctification, as we talked about, and perfect happiness in loving community with God and the blessed. And the problem, the reason why these are in tension with each other, it emerges when we take seriously the New Testament vision of moral sanctification that emerges out of Jesus' preaching of the love ethic, a love that extends even to the enemy, right? And when asked, right, what are the fundamental or most important commandments? Love God with all your heart and soul and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. When Jesus was asked, well, who is my neighbor? He sort of flips the script and tells, the story of the Good Samaritan, who, unlike the people who would have been respected by his audience, who walk by the injured robbery victim on the side of the Jericho road, the Good Samaritan, who belongs to the despised group, helps the person in need. And then Jesus, at the end of this parable says, who was a neighbor to the robbery victim, right? The question is not who is my neighbor. It's how do you be a good neighbor, right? And it's, you respond to the person in need, right? By acting to help them and assuage their need. That's what the love ethic calls for. Anytime you see someone in a situation of need, you respond to that. You reach out, you try to help. And that's elsewhere, Jesus makes clear that extends even to your enemy, right? So this is a very demanding ethic. If moral sanctification is construed in terms of this love ethic, what that means is that the blessed in heaven will love everyone, including their enemies. And that means including the damned or annihilated, including the lost. So if they're morally sanctified, it seems they would love the lost, those who are not saved, and their love would extend to them. And it also seems that if we love someone and they are lost, then the fitting emotional response is grief. And grief seems to be a disturbing element to perfect happiness, right? So put simply, if the blessed in heaven are morally sanctified, they'd love the lost. They love the lost, they'd grieve for them. If they grieve for them, they won't be perfectly happy. They might still be happy, but they won't be perfectly happy because there will be this diminishment of their happiness that is a response to the fact that persons they love are permanently excluded from this community. And that is, according to this argument, has a diminishing effect on happiness, right? So the idea is, if you believe in the doctrine of limited salvation, then you either have to give up on the moral sanctification of the blessed in order to preserve their perfect happiness, or you have to give up on the perfect happiness of the blessed in order to preserve their moral sanctification. So that's the problem of heavenly grief, and it is a problem that is related to an argument. It's a problem for anyone who believes in both of these doctrines, because there is an argument to the effect that the one doctrine excludes the other. And one of the things I do in the book is I try to sort of spell out in a very precise way, well, what are the premises of this argument from heavenly grief? And what I identify are, in effect, four key premises. The love premise, which is the premise that by virtue of their moral sanctification, the blessed are going to love the lost. The awareness premise, which is basically that if any are eternally lost, the blessed in heaven will be aware of this. You could try to protect the perfect happiness of the blessed by saying, oh, well, they would grieve for the loss if they knew that anyone were lost, but they don't, right? They're not aware of it. So the argument from heavenly grief assumes that they are aware of it, The fitting grief premise, which is the idea that grief is a fitting emotional response, a morally fitting emotional response to the loss of those we love. And if the blessed in heaven are morally perfected, then their emotions will be morally fitting. If their emotions are morally fitting, they will have fitting emotional responses to such things as those they love being eternally lost. And the fitting emotional response there is grief. Right. So that's what I call the fitting grief premise. And then finally, there's what I call the incompatibility premise. That is the premise that enduring grief is incompatible with perfect happiness. It's not incompatible with happiness, right? You can be happy and be sad about things in the world, but it is incompatible with perfect happiness, right? Because if your happiness is mixed with sadness, that is a disturbing element. It makes your happiness imperfect. Or that's at least the argument. So that's the problem of heavenly grief, is the problem that is faced by those who want to hold to both the doctrine of limited salvation and the doctrine of perfect blessedness. It's the problem of basically finding an adequate answer to this argument, or a solution to the problem by challenging the argument in some way. In the book, I distinguish between a solution to the problem, which basically tries to show that the argument from heavenly grief fails, in effect, and an escape from the problem. You escape the problem if you give up one of the two problematic doctrines, right? You escape the problem if you are a universalist, right? If you say, well, everyone is saved. If you reject the doctrine of limited salvation, then the problem, at least in the serious form, there are still some lingering questions about it. Well, if everyone is ultimately saved, still, while they're suffering in the world, while people remain unsaved, wouldn't the blessed grieve? We can maybe talk about this later. That's not as serious a problem as eternal loss, right? So universalism is an escape to the problem. If you reject the doctrine of perfect blessedness, you also escape the problem. Maybe you just say, yeah, no, the blessed in heaven, they aren't perfectly happy. They're happy, right? I mean, they've got God and the community of the blessed, and they've been morally sanctified and freed from sin. It's going to be a great life, but not a perfect life, because they're going to experience the sadness of the realization that people they love are lost to them eternally. So you reject the doctrine of perfect blessedness, you escape the problem. You reject the doctrine of limited salvation, you escape the problem. But is there a way to solve the problem? That's what the book explores. I mean, it sort of lays out the problem, it develops the problem, and then canvasses various attempts to solve the problem.
Yeah. No, it's funny how common it seems for this for people to not perceive this as a problem. Like, I know for myself, growing up and through a lot of my, my 20s or so, I'd say I probably would have subscribed to both of those views, right? So perfect blessedness of those in heaven, right? And as well as kind of a limited salvation view. And it never struck me at any point that there might be a hitch in that system, right? That those two actually might have serious incompatibilities. So I think it wasn't really until I started reading a little bit of David Bentley Hart that I started to see that there were some contradictions there. And I think your book really nicely and helpfully lays out some of those contradictions. I want to look at grief as kind of the experience of grief, right? Because this is something that you really kind of hone in on in your own book. You devote a whole kind of early chapter to several kind of portraits of this experience of grief, looking at grief especially as an emotion, right? An emotional experience. So why was it important for you, or why did you decide maybe to begin with emotions? And then also, are there any kind of dangers to, or shortcomings to kind of emphasizing that felt emotional experience of grief when it comes to thinking through sort of the truthfulness of kind of the dogmas around salvation?
Yeah. So for me, I take very seriously something that Marilyn McCord Adams says, and I'm actually going to quote from what she says here in at the end of this essay of hers on the problem of hell. She's talking about taking into account feelings as highly relevant for thinking about these kinds of theological problems. And then she recognizes, yeah, but feelings can go wrong. They are fallible, right? We can be misled by our feelings. And then she goes on, where questions of value are concerned, reason is not an infallible source either. That is why so-called value calculations in abstraction from feelings can strike us as cold or callous.
Hmm.
I do not believe we have any infallible faculties at all, but our best shot at valuations will come from the collaboration of feelings and reason, the latter articulating the former giving data to the latter. And so I would say, yes, with respect to your second question, of your paired question, there are risks to focusing on emotions or feelings, but there are also risks to ignoring them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we need to avoid both of those kinds of risks. So, relative to this particular book, it's a book that is dealing with this distinctive problem, this problem of heavenly grief, and so the emotion of grief as a potential disturbing element in the happiness of the blessed, if grief is an appropriate emotion for them to feel in response to the lost. Um, I mean, that emotion plays a central role, and so I think in order to think well about that emotion, about the question of what does this emotion reduce joy? Uh, is this emotion fitting or appropriate in certain contexts? Is it fitting or appropriate even with respect to um, um, people who we've lost because of their own stupidity or mismanagement of their lives, this sort of thing? I think we can't talk about those things responsibly without investigating the emotion of grief,
Mm-hmm.
reflecting on it honestly, and looking at portraits of grief as I do. So I think, I mean, that's one reason why I devote as much time as I do to it. I think we need to sort of vicariously inhabit the experience of the emotion of grief through stories or portraits of grief, um, and reflect on that to draw lessons about what grief is, about when and where it is fitting, and about how it affects us. Because
Mm-hmm.
all of those things are relevant to the argument from heavenly grief. So we need that data.
Mm-hmm.
And the best way to sort of get that data is to get in tune with, to some extent, our own experience of grief. That said, there are risks if you don't then reflect thoughtfully on that data, if you will. If you don't think carefully and responsibly, there's risks of things going wrong. And so I think Adams is really on track when she says that we need both things interacting with one another, each providing a check and a guide for the other in a certain sense. Now, there's another dimension to this, which comes up in sort of later chapters of the book, and this is related to the following idea. Well, first off, I'm a moral realist. I think Christianity fits best with a kind of moral realism. That is, the idea that values are objective parts of reality. They're moral truths or objective truths. They're not just subjective projections. Our emotions are value laden. So joy is an emotional experience. It's judging with feeling that all is well, right? So there's this value judgment that's bound up with the emotion. Grief is likewise the judgment with feeling that something good is gone, right? Fear is the emotional judgment that something good is in danger of being gone or taken away, right? So emotions are bound up with values, and if values are real, then we have to ask, this question about, well, how do these emotions, which are about values, relate to these values? And there's one sort of school of thought, and I'm drawn to this school of thought that says that emotions are to values something like the way our senses are to the empirical world. They are our means of perceiving it in a certain sense, but they can misperceive it, right? And they can be defective, right? Our senses can be defective. We can see things wrong. We can misperceive things even when our senses are not defective. And so, just as in the case of our senses, we need reason to be a guide and a check, if you will. I need if something that appears to me to be the case isn't a good fit with things that I thought I knew, then I'm going to be inclined to be skeptical of the veracity of my sense experience in that moment. And likewise with emotions, I think they are a key sort of source of moral knowledge, if you will, but they are a fallible one, and they need to be integrated with rational reflection before we can trust them. And this further connects up with something else I talk about in the book, which has to do with virtue ethics. Virtue ethics holds that that our emotions or feelings admit of a right time, right place, right extent of
Mhm.
expression,
Yeah.
right? And that's and when we feel emotions the right time, the right place, to the right extent, then we have the character trait that is a virtue with respect to that emotion, which lies uh, as a kind of mean between the extremes of excess and deficiency. So we're like, our emotions are correctly attuned to reality, both
Mm.
moral and empirical reality, when we have moral virtue. So we become angry to the extent that it's fitting to become angry, and not
Right.
more, and not less, in response to what's going on. And if anger is associated with a judgment that an injustice is being done, then we don't become angry if no injustice is being done. And we do become angry when an injustice is being done, but the extent of our anger um, reflects accurately the scope of the injustice or the degree of wrong that's being done. We don't become furious at minor slights, for example.
Right.
Um, so this virtue theory holds that these moral virtues are dispositions of character with respect to our emotions, that obtain when our emotions are tracking reality properly. Um, of course, the implication there is that our emotions can fail to track reality properly. And
Mhm.
that's why we have to be cautious or careful, right? Now, bringing that back to the book, where I'm looking at the emotion of grief, I don't have access to the morally perfected emotional experience of the blessed in heaven, right? I have access to the emotional experiences of people, flawed, finite people in this world, and I'm trying to extrapolate from my sense of the best version of human emotionality in this life to what perfected emotions among those in heaven would be like. And that's, of course, a fallible exercise. And there are risks involved in that process, and I acknowledge that. But the flip side of that is that to try to do that work and try to sort of think about how the blessed in heaven would feel without reflecting on our own emotional experience and thinking about, well, when do we regard these emotions as virtuous, as expressions of virtuous character traits, and as fitting and emotional responses, and when don't we? To fail to engage in that work would be just to speculate without the best evidence and data that we have, even if that data is limited and flawed.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, no, that's all very helpful. I wanna jump ahead to, the part in the book where you talk about, the argument from heavenly sympathy, as you call it. So, this is sort of an argument that we see Schleiermacher presenting,
Mhm.
and then much later Thomas Talbot. So they're both sort of doing it in their own way, or perhaps presenting similar arguments, which could fall under the banner of this sort of argument from heavenly sympathy, which, as I understand it, is distinct from kind of the argument from heavenly grief that you're presenting in the book. So how would you describe what Schleiermacher and Talbot are up to when they are making this sort of argument from heavenly sympathy?
Yeah, so their focus is on a different emotional response than grief. Their focus is on sympathy, and I mean they're developing an argument that is similar in form to the problem of heavenly grief, but it focuses on the idea that the blessed in heaven, if they're morally perfected, will have sympathy for the plight, the suffering of the damned. And that sympathy that they have for the plight or the suffering of the damned will mean that they feel bad about their misery, and there's a sort of negative impact on the happiness of the blessed if they feel bad about the suffering of those in such misery. So that's the basic gist of their argument. It's similar in structure to the argument from heavenly grief. One of the differences between that argument and the argument from heavenly grief is that argument, the argument from heavenly sympathy, is only targeting the doctrine of hell. It does not target annihilationism, right? So, for example, if you're an annihilationist who thinks that those who die, apart from God, just go out of existence, you escape the problem of heavenly sympathy, because there is no one who's suffering, right? Who the blessed would feel sorry for in hell. So they wouldn't have these sympathetic pains towards the enduring anguish of people in hell. They would, because there would be no such persons, right? And I wanted to broaden the consideration beyond the doctrine of hell to also think about all versions of limited salvation. And it seems to me that an emotional response to the loss of the unsaved is as worthy of attention as the emotional response to the suffering and misery of the unsaved.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think that if the doctrine of hell, if we embrace the doctrine of hell, then both of those emotional responses would be in play and would have to be taken into account in thinking about the state of the blessed. But grief is something that, right, I mean, in our own experience, where if we have a loved one who is suffering terribly from a fatal disease, and then they finally die, awareness of their suffering brings with it emotional pain, right? That we associate with the concept of sympathy. And that pain goes away when they die, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they're not suffering anymore. And there's almost a sense of relief
Mm-hmm.
that their suffering is over. But that's when the full measure of grief hits us, right? Because now they're gone. And there's the negative emotions of the loss of that loved one. Of course, if your loved one is damned to hell and you're in heaven, then you're going to experience both of those things, because you're cut off from them, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
separated from them. They are not part of this community that of joy that you belong to, and so you will grieve that loss, but you will also feel the sympathy for their suffering. If annihilationism is correct, you won't sympathize with their suffering, but you would still grieve their loss. So the two arguments are similar and they overlap in various ways, but the problem of heavenly grief extends more broadly to basically incorporate any version of the doctrine of limited salvation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. So earlier you talked about the kind of four basic premises of your argument from Heavenly Grief, which you kind of lay out very clearly in your book, and then later in the book you have a couple chapters where you're highlighting some of the kind of purported solutions to those basic premises, especially to ones that are involving kind of the love premise, as you call it. So this premise that the blessed will be perfected in love, as well as purported solutions involving or engaging with the fitting grief premise, as you call it. So this premise that the blessed will kind of fittingly experience enduring grief if any other persons, especially loved ones, don't share in that state of perfect blessedness. So first, maybe let's talk about the ones that are engaging with the love premise, and then maybe we can move to ones that are engaging with the fitting grief premise. So how would you kind of describe some of the purported solutions that you see on offer to the love premise in particular? And then what about those solutions do you find wanting?
Yeah. So, in effect, the idea here is that you solve the problem of heavenly grief by rejecting one of the premises of the argument from heavenly grief. Right. So, one way to solve the problem is to reject the love premise, which, as I've described it, holds that the blessed in heaven have a love that extends to all the lost. Um, I should further qualify this that I in the book note that there is an agapic love that encompasses uh, any person who is a bearer of inherent value, and then there is a personal love, which
Mm,
is born out of an interpersonal relationship with another person in which you experience them as a being with value and subjectively value their existence, right? So you love them in a more personal way. And my own idea, my own thought is that God being unlimited, there would be no distinction between these two things. God's agapic love would be intensely personal. For finite creatures, we have a finite capacity to know and experience the value of individual uh, creatures, and attend to them as bearers of value. Um, as creatures of God and bearers of God's image, and all these things.
mhm,
Um, we have a limited capacity to experience that personally, experience that in an immediate personal way. Um, and so the moral perfection of our finite human capacity for love would involve continuing to love those that we love in this personal way, but but out of a recognition of the fact that all persons have this value, affirm that value and seek, to the extent that our finite capacities enable us to do so, affirm that value as something worth preserving and nurturing. And
mhm,
so the love premise, as I understand it, involves this universal love. Uh, in humans, it involves a universal love that is perhaps not as intense as our personal love, but it also includes our personal love. And the the solution to the problem that I sort of consider first is a solution that, in a sense, rejects this view of what it is for the blessed to be morally sanctified. It rejects the idea that the blessed in heaven will love all the lost in some general way, while continuing to love any of the lost that they loved in this life in the more personal way.
mhm,
Um, and I mean, there's different ways you could try to deal with this. James Spiegel has this solution that he calls the love webs solution. And the basic idea there is, he basically agrees with me that the blessed in heaven will not lose their personal love for anyone, because that would be a diminishment of them. And so for him, it's imperative that that anyone whom the blessed loves personally isn't cut off eternally from them, because that would be a source of grief, he thinks. And so his idea is that God will ensure that if I'm saved, everyone I love personally is also saved. This love web, and so the main thrust is to suggest that this won't entail universalism, because the scope of my personal love is finite. And so now the more sort of troubling question is, what if some are eternally lost by virtue of their own choices, right? And of course, there's different views here, but if some are eternally lost by virtue of their own choices, what guarantee do I have that those I personally love will all make the right choices, and so my love web will be complete? And I mean, it seems like there is no way to guarantee such perfect, closed love webs apart from some kind of divine intervention in which God makes sure that everyone I love personally ends up making the right choices, right? So some kind of efficacious grace that of the sort that Calvinists talk about, where God will change the will, right, so that they willingly repent. The sort of grace that more libertarian-minded Wesleyans and Arminians say, wait, no, that would violate their freedom, right? It seems like the only way for Spiegel to maintain his love webs is to, in effect, say that if I'm saved, then if there's anyone who would not be saved by their own choices without this infusion of divine efficacious grace, God would infuse efficacious grace, right? And thereby guarantee that everyone I personally love is saved. The problem I have with that is that it effectively depends upon the premise that it is morally acceptable for God to change the heart of anyone to a willing heart who doesn't do so themselves. And that and if God loves everyone, right, and that is acceptable, and there's nothing wrong with God's doing that, then it seems as if the most reasonable conclusion would be that all are saved, right? Because God would change the heart of everyone so that everyone can enjoy blessedness. So the only way to guard against that is to say that God's love is not universal, or is restricted in some way, that God doesn't love all. And that I spend a fair bit of time arguing, it just doesn't seem to be a good fit with the biblical witness. So I don't think that's an acceptable move, and I sort of lay out my reasons why that God's sort of a limited divine love doesn't seem to jive for me, at least, with the New Testament witness. But then the other problem there is that whole love webs perspective supposes that the blessed in heaven, that the only problem is that the blessed in heaven will have this personal love for some maybe of the damned. But if you take seriously the agapic tradition within Christianity that understands the love command and the idea that we're to love even our enemy as a call to cultivate a universal love for all bearers of intrinsic value that are persons, then there's still a problem, right? For any doctrine of limited salvation, because even if all of those I personally loved in heaven, are personally loved on earth are in heaven with me, if I have this agapic love for all that is genuine in the sense of recognizing the value, and any are eternally lost, then I will experience that loss as the loss of something genuinely good, and being perfected in my emotions, I will experience that on an emotional way. I will feel the fitting emotional response, which is grief. And even if it's not as intense as the grief of a personal loved one, it's still going to be a disturbing element in bliss. So that's one of the responses that I look at length with respect to the love premise, and through it I sort of tackle those who want to sort of restrict the scope of the love of the blessed so that it excludes the damned. And it just seems that any such development of the Christian love ethic that doesn't extend to all is a poor fit with the New Testament witness.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So how about some of the kind of major purported solutions that you talk about that are more so addressing the fitting grief premise? And in what ways do you see those particular solutions kind of falling short?
Yeah. So I mean, there's different ways of approaching this, but the fitting grief premise is that some negative emotions, a negative emotional response of grief to the loss of objectively valuable persons is fitting, right? It's appropriate. One strategy that I've seen that tries to respond to this is it invokes the old, classical theist notion of divine impassibility, that God experiences, in effect, no negative emotions. And and then basically suggests, well, maybe the blessed in heaven are like that too. There are several reasons to be suspicious of that move. One is that, well, just reasons to be suspicious of the old doctrine of divine impassibility. There are many sort of more recent theologians who have argued or against or challenged this divine impassibility idea in various ways. But what I focus mainly on is the idea that any such impassibility would be the perfection of our human natures. We are human beings. We're not God. We're different from God. But our moral sanctification would be the perfection of our human natures. And we are emotional creatures. And negative emotional responses to bad things, when they fit the bad things, seems to be part of what it is to be a good person, right? If I right? I think my wife is a better person than me to the extent that she cries when she hears about terrible things happening to people she doesn't know, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel this twinge of, oh, that's terrible, but I don't feel it, right, as deeply, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a way in which she's morally better than me. Um, and that seems to be part of our human nature to feel these negative emotions to bad things, and and that when the negative emotion tracks something that's genuinely bad, that means that the person is in tune with the
Mm-hmm.
reality of that badness in a way that that is good morally. And I think the ultimate reason to think that that's part of human moral sanctification is the fact that in Scripture, Jesus, who is supposed to be a perfected human, is reported to have wept, right? Uh, and and that suggests, I think, quite clearly that human moral sanctification is going to include grief, and that the idea that the blessed in heaven will experience divine impassibility doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Um, so that's, I mean, that's one of the sort of moves that's invoked to try to challenge the fitting grief premise. There are
Mm-hmm.
others that are a bit more complicated, but I am aware of time, and I don't want to, potential readers who are listening to this podcast, I don't want to, give away all of the
Yeah.
So,
You don't
so
want to
I'll
give
stop
away
you
all the
there.
goodies.
I'll do that for now.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's great. Okay, so you've kind of shown us some of the purported solutions to this problem of heavenly grief, and then you move in kind of your final chapter of the book to describing your own not a solution, as you said earlier, but an escape rather to this problem of heavenly grief. So what how would you kind of describe this escape that you put forward?
Yeah. So, I mean, my preferred way to address the problem of heavenly grief is to escape it by embracing uh, a doctrine of universal salvation. Right. And one of the things I sort of make clear throughout the book is that every solution or escape we look at, we have to say, all right, what are the costs, right, of that solution? Right? What are the bullets we have to bite if we go with that solution? And you need to do some comparative work, right? Like part of the reason why many are more drawn to trying to solve the problem by giving up one of the premises of the argument from heavenly grief is because they think that's going to be less costly in some way than giving up on either the doctrine of limited salvation or the doctrine of perfect blessedness. What I do in the last chapter of the book is question the purported costliness of giving up the doctrine of limited salvation. Right?
Mm,
People think it's costly to go the universalist way because it's not scriptural, or because um, it doesn't do justice to divine justice,
mm,
uh, or it doesn't leave room for human freedom. Right? These are sort of the main sort of purported
mhm,
costs. And so one of the things that I sort of do in the last chapter is walk through, well, is it really unscriptural to be a universalist? And so I sort of consider universalist passages in scripture, as well as how we might interpret the scriptural passages and themes that are generally thought to oppose universalism
mhm,
in ways that are actually compatible with universalism, especially a version of universalism that accepts a doctrine of hell but sees it as a finite state that ultimately comes to an end for all. in terms of questions about divine justice, I spend a little bit of time talking about that. One of the key issues here has to do with, well, I mean, is eternal damnation for finite human sins really just? Right, that's one sort of important question. Those who say yes, it really is, often appeal to Anselm, but they forget that Anselm used that idea as a premise for his argument for the need or necessity of the vicarious atonement, right? His idea was that human sin is infinitely grave and nothing humans can do can make up for it. But God demands that justice be done and that sin be made up for, right? And so God does it on our behalf, right? God meets the demands of justice on our behalf because we can't do it for ourselves. Even if we're sent to hell eternally, first of all, that doesn't deal with the idea of making it up to God, right? We don't make anything up to God by suffering the just punishment for our sins, even if that was just. But the other side of the problem with seeing eternal damnation as meeting the demands of justice is that you can only suffer so much at any given moment if you're a finite creature, and an eternal sentence never reaches the end. And so you never reach a point at which we have paid an infinite penalty for sin if we're subjected to eternal damnation. And so there's real problems with the idea that eternal damnation meets the demands of justice. And I think an awareness of those problems is what motivates the doctrine of the atonement that we find in Anselm, that basically says that God has met the demands of justice on our behalf through Christ's sacrifice on the cross. And if that's true, then justice is not an impediment to the salvation of all. And so that it doesn't seem as if Universalism has this cost that is often attributed to it of not doing justice to divine justice. So the final purported cost is related to human freedom and the idea that a doctrine of universal salvation doesn't allow people or respect. It implies that God fails to respect the freedom of creatures to reject divine grace and the offer of loving communion. And that, I think, is the most serious worry. So I spend the most time with it. But ultimately, I think, without getting into all the weeds, we need to distinguish between the freedom that I have to reject divine grace at a particular moment, and the idea that I should be free to, at a particular moment, reject God for all moments, all time. It seems that to say that I need to respect your freedom to make a decision now for all time that's problematic, because if you make a decision now for all time, what you're basically doing is removing your freedom with respect to that choice at every subsequent moment, right, in your future. And if I really care about your freedom, I wouldn't set things up so that you have that kind of freedom, the freedom to, in a particular moment, deny yourself the freedom at every subsequent moment to change your mind. So it seems that a maximal respect for human freedom is going to not give people that kind of freedom, but give people instead the freedom to, at every moment, make a choice relative to something and retain the freedom to change their mind. But if human beings have the freedom to change their mind about divine grace, and they go to hell and they experience how terrible hell is, and they retain the freedom to change their mind and turn to God, and God is on the case, using divine infinite resourcefulness to not coerce but persuade those who reject that they've made the wrong choice. And they simultaneously experience what it is to reject divine grace. They have a firsthand experience of just how bad it is. The idea that they would eternally reject an infinite sequence of moments for all eternity, while continuing to experience more and more fully just how terrible their choice was, without ever hitting bottom. Right? Alcoholics Anonymous talks about hitting your bottom, right, where
Mm-hmm.
you hit this point where you realize just how unmanageable and unworkable your life is because of drinking, and that sort of triggers this transformation where you then stumble into an AA meeting maybe, and it opens you up to that first step of recognizing that your life has become unmanageable and turning your life over to God. Just the idea that in an infinite existence, there are some people for whom this will never happen is, to me, similar to the idea that if I flip a coin an infinite number of times, it will never land tails up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's possible. It's in a certain sense, but the probability is infinitesimally small. It's not a real probability at all. And likewise, I think that given the mathematics of infinity, the probability that genuinely free creatures who retain the freedom to change their minds or repent over an indefinite number of choice opportunities, the probability that any of them will eternally reject divine grace is infinitesimally small, and so we shouldn't believe that it's real.
Mm-hmm.
That's the basic my basic response to the argument pertaining to human freedom. Given infinite opportunity, even free creatures will eventually wise up, especially
Mm-hmm.
if there is an infinitely resourceful God who loves them, who's on the case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you, Eric. It's a really rich book. It's been a wonderful conversation today. Obviously, there's lots more we could talk about. A very intricate argument you lay out here. So, for those who are interested in knowing more or in hearing more from Eric, would strongly encourage you to go buy the book. Before we close things out, though, I want to give you an opportunity to share about kind of any thing you have in the works. I know you talked about a book you're working on Martin Luther King and nonviolent resistance. So I don't know if there's anything more you want to say about that, or any other works you have in progress or that you've recently published. Anything that you'd like to share about here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've already talked about the King book that I'm working on. I have other books I've written, including a co-authored book on Universalism and the Doctrine of Hell with John Kronen called God's Final Victory, that in a quite systematic and analytically rigorous way lays out the arguments that I sketched about the last chapter in Escaping the Problem. And Yeah, no, I'm good.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Eric. For listeners, again, the title of the book is Troubled Paradise, Limited Salvation, and the Problem of Heavenly Grief. You can find it on Amazon or on Whiffenstock's website or anywhere books are sold. Thank you, Eric, so much for taking the time today.
My pleasure.